All right, it's time to bust a myth. One of the longest standing and most accepted myths there are. Wait till I'm done, okay? You're gonna be like, wow, I never thought of that. All right, so the myth is that new cars last longer and are more reliable than old cars, classic cars, typically the ones from the 1960s and 70s that we deal with on this channel. That's the myth. In the old days, cars would only last 80 to 100,000 miles, and then you'd have to get rid of it and get another one. But today's cars will last 2, 3, 4, 500,000 miles. They keep going. Can you argue with this? No. Typically, in the old days, a car was retired at 80 or 100,000 miles. That was it. It was done. Something went wrong with it. It was going to the junkyard. But today, they're just barely broken in. I'm not going to dispute that. That's a fact. But it has nothing to do with the machines themselves. It has to do with consumer psychology. It has to do with marketing. It has to do with certain elements that are built into cars, or were built into cars, that gave the owner the impression that it was the end of the line, time to move on. There were things designed into those cars. The very same things that we look at old cars and we say, man, they're so beautiful, they're so stylish, they've got personality, charisma, character, all of those things, all of those elements, we look at these cars and we love them for it. Those are the things that make consumers hate them and want to get rid of them when they hit that 80, 100,000 mile mark. Crazy, right? All right, follow along now. Post-war America, you had the emergence of what became the American dream, right? A house in the suburbs, 2.4 kids, a car in the driveway, all of that stuff, right? The barbecue in the backyard, the American dream. It was a product of marketers. It never really existed to that point, but this was the ideal, and this is what they made the consumers strive for. Because in the 1950s, we really became a consumer-guided society, or a consumer-driven society. So if you look at the post-war era, suburban sprawl, and the need for family transportation, a family car. Now remember, we're not talking about car freaks here, because car freaks, we're in the vast minority. We only make up maybe 5%, if that, of the total car population. And that's all we've ever been. We've always been just a small percentage. The greatest percent, 90, 95%, you look at the car as a utility, yes, slightly an extension of their personality, but for the most part, it's transportation. But in the mind of the consumer and in the mind of the person, especially in the 1950s, 1960s, a sign of affluence. It was a sign, transportation, but it was also your status, right? This is what you're driving. You're driving the newest type of car. The current style. You're in with it, right? You're there. Automakers knew this. They understood it was the housewife that typically influenced the purchase. It was the man in the house that went and bought the car and maintained it and did all of that, but it had to be through the approval of the woman. It had to fit her basic tastes or ideals, and it had to fit that suburban lifestyle and give that little status boost. Keeping up with the Joneses, right? Keeping up with the neighbors. This was a big thing back then, right? Social competition. And it was designed by the corporations. They wanted people to have this one-upmanship with each other because everybody profits. So, beginning in that post-war period, automotive styling started to become very important. Previous to the war, it was there. There were some beautiful cars, but there were a lot of, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of beautiful cars, but the average car that the average person was buying was more utilitarian than anything else. Post-war, the cars had to make a statement. The cars that they were selling to the average middle-class consumer had to make a statement. And because of that, all of those things, all of the names and the images and all of that stuff, that's what I'm looking for. the aura of those cars, right? The Bonneville, starchy, Pontiac was right on top of this, right? The Starliner, Oldsmobile. But you get the general idea, right? The names and the styling of the car created an image, and this image was what the average middle-class person was after, so they bought it. Now, here's the ironic thing about cars from the 1950s, when this really defined styling started to come about. I was recently looking over a 56 Buick, and I noticed as I'm looking over the car that literally every single possible wear point, upper control arm bushings, I mean, you name it, any place where there's possible wear, there was a Zerk fitting. So whoever designed, or the engineers that designed the mechanical aspects of this car, they wanted this thing to last forever. They wanted it to be quiet and bulletproof and maintainable forever. Extra effort in the engineering. Something we as mechanics really came to appreciate. But that was in spite of the fact that the styling of the car was its own planned obsolescence. So what they did was, beginning, like I said, in the 1950s or so, they made it a point to change, so they would introduce a model. There's all the manufacturers. They would introduce a model targeted someplace within that broad spectrum of the suburbanite, the typical car buyer. Middle class, suburbanite car buyer, someplace in that range to fit their taste or their interest or their area. They would introduce the car, they would craft its image, they'd style it. It was just right on target. It was just absolutely perfect. But every year, they would make a change to it. And typically, that body, the main body, or the main car, would go through 2 or 3 facelifts. And then it would be rebodied as something else. Now, when you're in that world of suburban, keeping up with the Joneses, this brand new American dream thing, and we're all in this, well, that's a crisis. That's a crisis, because you bought this car, and suddenly, just 3 years later, as soon as you finished paying for it, it looks obsolete. Your neighbor next door bought the newest version of it, and it has a fin, and it has this extra bit of chrome here, and the whole front end is more streamlined, and it looks like a spaceship, and yours looks kind of like a pregnant whale, sorta, right? And it's this has got to go. There's a planned obsolescence. It was a psychological maneuver to get the average person to become disenfranchised with this car that they were in love with, because now it represented a lack of status. Go and buy a new one. And typically, at that point, there were still a lot of people who were paying cash for cars, but the typical car loan was 2 or 3 years. The styling changes kind of coincided with the car loan period. And so did the odometer, but I'm going to get to that in a couple of minutes. Now, also, if you look at this period of time, beginning, let's say, in the 1950s, you've got a 5-year revolution, right, in the overall styling of cars, right? So now this isn't a specific thing. It's not like you go from 1950 to 1955 and then 1960. There's overlapping periods. It's an evolution. But what I mean is, look at a car from the period between a car's design, styled, between 1950 and 1955. Now picture 55 to 60, right? And you see a completely different type of car come about, right? And this is where it went from just a soft kind of melted ice cream cone look that later became like the Taurus, right? Decades later. But you had that soft, roundish 1950, post-war 1950 to 54 look. And then 55, you've got typically the 55 Chevy, think of it that way, right? And then you've got every year it got updated again. So 56, they changed a little bit. 57, they changed a little bit more. And 58, completely rebodied. So now you take the cars from 1950 to 55 or thereabouts, and you got a snapshot of what they look like. Then you get the cars from 55 to 60, and you got a snapshot of what they look like. And then from 60 to 65, you have another snapshot of what they look like. You see what I'm saying? It's profound 65 to 70, and then 70 to 75. and then 75 to 80, right? So to define those eras, I know I'm probably like going really long on this, but just to make the point, okay? So the middle 50s, 55 to like 60 was the space look, the forward look, right? The fins, long, exaggerated, you know, like, okay, you saw it with lots and lots of chrome, crazy chrome. Then 60 to 65, things became more refined, less flamboyant, more dignified, right? 65 to 70, they became very organic and muscular. They had to have hips and curves, right? You know, picture a Camaro or a Charger, or, you know, okay? That's your typical 65 to 70 car. Then 70 to 75, almost futuristic. Like you look at a car, you look at like take for example, a 71 Charger, or better than that, a Cuda. Look at a 7071 Cuda or 7071 Satellite. I'm a Mopar guy, so these are the cars that I go by, right? In my imagination. They look timeless. You build it today, you put it on the showroom floor today, and it's like, yes, that's beautiful. That fuselage sort of styling. Then 75 to 80, you end up with a push towards economy and simplistic looking cars, but you also get to push the other way too, and you got the opera windows and the crushed, you know, the Corinthian leather and the grills, the stand-up grills, and see what I'm saying? So every 5 years or so, automotive styling had like a revolutionary turn. This played havoc with the style conscious and the status conscious middle class consumer. You know, I give you a quick example of where I actually picked up on this, where I learned about this, right? It was 1986. Actually, it was late 1985. And I was working for CSK Publishing, doing a bunch of their magazines. And we got a 1986 test car, and I don't remember what it was. But one of the things, we're all sitting around the office now, and we're talking about the stuff on the car and how universally we hate this third center-mounted brake light that they put in there. Oh, it was a Regal, it was a T-type. We loved the car, but we hated that third center-mounted taillight that they federally mandated for 1986. And it was like, why? This is stupid, this is ugly. The publisher's wife happened to be in the room while we're discussing this, okay? And she's like, what do you mean? So he says, yeah, in all 1986 cars now, they have to have this center-mounted taillight. She freaked out. She was like, what do you mean all of them have it? I says, yeah, that's the new thing for 1986. She has a crisis now because she's so style conscious. She's so fashion conscious, right? So status, publisher's wife. She can't sleep at night if she's seen driving around in the previous year's model. She trades in, it was a Vet, they got rid of the Vet and they ordered an LSC, an 86 LSC, because it had the third center mounted brake light. It didn't end there though, because once she got her car, the other women in the office, there were a couple in advertising and in the art department, they all had older cars, but they all had to go out and get the kit to mount the third center brake light in their back window. They were that style conscious. So this gives you the idea of how the average person, not the car person, but the average person sees their cars. All right, so now picture this, okay? You're middle class person, you buy this car, you buy your 1960 car, and it looks all the newest stuff, right? And it's got, you took a 3-year loan on it, you're gonna be paying for this till 1963. It's got a 100,000 mile odometer on it. Now, as you're coming to the end of your car loan, right, the end of your period of car loan, the car's been in regular use. The odometer is starting to read somewhere around 80,000 miles. The odometer only goes to 100,000 miles. Now, in your unsophisticated consumer mind, you're saying to yourself, this thing is going to run out of miles real soon. You know, it's only intended to go, it's only designed to go 100,000 miles. It only has a 6-place odometer. So once it reaches 99,999.9 miles, it's done. This is the psychology of it. And this is why odometers back in the day only read to that digit. Because you would reach that 80 to 100,000 mile mark at around the 3-year mark, at around the time that the styling would be radically changed out in traffic, the newer cars, and it made you not like the car you were driving. Now this car that you bought because this thing makes me feel good, this is good status, look, my nicer car than my neighbor has. Now all of a sudden it looks outdated and it's coming to the end of its life. You now want to get rid of this car. It's time to trade it in. It's time to get rid of it, or it's time to sell it. But either way, you don't want to maintain it anymore. When you first got the car, every weekend it was washed, it was waxed, it was pampered, it was vacuumed, everything. If you drove it through snow and you got salt on it, everything got washed, and you bring it to the car wash and do the undercarriage wash. Or a lot of places back then, shops had outside lifts, and when I first started working on cars, that was a pretty common thing. If you had an outside lift, you put the customer would bring you the car after the spring would come, you'd put the car up on lift and pressure wash everything underneath and then lube everything underneath. This was a common thing. But when that car, the styling is becoming outdated, it's got a couple of scratches, it's got a couple of dings, it's almost out of mileage because you're coming up on that 100,000 mile mark, right? The psychology is, I'm not going to maintain this thing, I'm going to get rid of it. And at that point, they stopped taking care of the cars. They stopped with the regular oil changes. They stopped with the tune-ups. They stopped with anything, unless something was falling off the car, they didn't maintain it. Now, mechanically, there was a piece, there's one part that I account, now this is my own personal experience, and this is working on these cars since the 70s, since they were new. My personal experience with cars of that era that dropped dead, right? So in other words, like, person's using it and it stopped running and they're like, I'm not gonna fix this thing anymore, I'm gonna junk it, or I'm gonna, okay. The part that went bad, more often than not, right? And you old-time mechanics, you're gonna know exactly what, you already know what I'm saying, what I'm gonna say, right? Malfunctions with the choke. So, there were several different ways chokes were actuated back in the day, right? And the choke is just a necessary part of a carbureted engine. It's the coolant temp sensor of the old days. It just tells the engine, it tells the carburetor, the engine is cold, shuts the flap, cuts off air, basically enriches, makes the mixture super rich so the engine will idle nicer. So the choke and the choke pull-off are two items that would go bad at around that 70, 80, 90,000 mile mark that would cause the car to run like hell. So the choke, when the choke itself, either the heat source for the choke, and a lot of cars, like for instance Fords, used a heat tube that would come up from the exhaust manifold and go to a heat stove that would actuate the choke. That would rust, corrode, get clogged with carbon, okay? It wouldn't function anymore. The choke wouldn't get warm, and the person would be driving around with the choke mostly closed. So the car seems like it's normal. Oh, I just had it tuned up, 3 months ago. Everything's great, but it runs like hell and it burns a ton of gas. It's because the choke stopped opening either at all or fully, right? So the thing was always running rich. And because it was always running rich, you would foul the plugs, you'd put a bunch of gasoline in the oil, you'd wash out the rings, the engine would the valves would become all carboned up, and when the valves become carboned up, they don't help heat and atomize the fuel, so efficiency falls off the map. So you've got this car that when it was new and everything was functioning good, it was getting 17, 18 miles to the gallon, starts, accelerates, runs smooth, clean, and everything else. And now it's got 80,000 miles on it. You don't know why, because you're not a mechanic, and you don't really care to bring it to a mechanic because it's almost at the end of its life. You just deal with however it runs, and now it chugs, it blows black smoke, it gets 8 miles to the gallon. It gives you the impression that this thing is completely worn out. It's because the choke stopped working. And it was the same thing with these choke pull-offs. When the choke pull-off would go bad, there's a little, for you guys who don't know, the choke pull-off is a little diaphragm that opens the choke slightly. So the choke is closed all the way when the engine is off and cold. When it first starts, some vacuum is sent to this piece right here, the actuator, and it opens up the choke just slightly. Well, if the choke pull-off doesn't work, for the first minute or so that the car is running, it's just dumping gas, dumping gas, dumping gas, much more than the engine wants. It'll foul the plugs, and it'll run like hell. And if you're just making short trips, it'll always run like hell, the engine will never clear up, even after the engine completely warms up. These are the things that would commonly go bad in the 70, 80, 90,000, pushing towards 100,000 mile mark, that made these cars appear to run like hell, to be useless. They're done, they're used up. And look, the odometer even says it only goes to 99,000 miles. It says that it's used up. The typical non-car consumer at that point hates their car, it's outdated, it runs like hell, it's drinking gas like crazy, I'm getting rid of this damn thing, and they go and they buy another one. And it was designed that way. The frequent styling changes, the styling revolutions. Think about how much car styling has changed in the last 30 years, because it really hasn't, okay? Look at how much car styling has changed in the last 30 years. And then look at the revolutionary changes between, like, say, 1950, 1955, 1960, 65, 1970, 75. Think of the revolutionary styling changes, distinct eras that came along, like rapid fire, like machine guns. That worked on the consumer, right? It told the consumer, this car is old. Even though it's new, even though it's, it's only 3 years old, it's outdated. It runs like hell. It's not worth putting money into this thing because, and they're rotting like crazy because people stop washing them. First couple of years, you have, back in New York, I remember back in the day, after, like after a thaw, have a snowstorm and you have a thaw and you have all the salt on the road, and there would be a sea of white cars. Like top to bottom, front to back, they were just pure white because they're all covered with salt. Well, when that car is new and fresh and it's in style, right? Yeah, as soon as you can, you get that thing all cleaned up, and you get in there with a hose and you wash out the wheel openings and stuff like that. Not when it gets to that point that it's, oh, the neighbor has a nicer car, it's the newer car, or this is the old style. I hate this car, I want to get rid of this car. You stop taking care of it, they rust like crazy. Now, it's not to say that they didn't make improvements in rust proofing in typical cars through the 70s and 80s and up to today. They have, there's no question about it. But those older cars would not have rusted if the owners had just maintained them by hosing off or pressure washing out the salt that would gather under the car. I could go on and on and on with this. So, around the middle 1980s, from the beginning of the car loans started out, oh God, I mean, for as long as they've been building cars, you've had car loans. And the car loans typically ran from 1 to 3 years. And if you drive your car, let's say 25, 30,000 miles a year, 3 years brings you to like 90,000 miles. You close to that magic 100,000 mile mark. So your loan is about done. You're done paying your loan at about the time that the styling on the car is over, and about the time the odometer says you're done with this thing and it's ready for the scrap heap. Around the middle 1980s, 4-year car loans and then 5-year car loans started to become the norm, because the price of cars, the average cost of cars, in comparison to the average family income, average household income, started to go up. Now people are saying to themselves, I put 100,000 miles on a car every 3 years. 2 years after it's junked, I'm still gonna be paying for this thing with a 5-year loan? I can't do that. So the automakers started including that next digit. So now 200,000, 300,000, the consumer looks at the car and says, I could go 1,000,000 miles with this. Sure, I'll pay 5 years, 6 years, 7-year loan. I'm set. And at the same time, they stopped with those frequent and very distinctive styling changes. So now if you bought a car in 1990, well, it still kind of looked relevant in 1998. You buy a car in 2000, it still looks relevant in 2015. You don't care. And the miles keep going. So it was more a factor of styling and consumer psychology that had to do with the longevity of the older cars than anything to do with the cars themselves. Now, from a mechanics standpoint, everybody back in the day, let's say in the 70s, the 80s, and even the 90s, Everybody knew the one guy on the block in the neighborhood, and I could even picture mine, right? My guy, the cheap neighbor. I had this one guy, and this is right up till I moved to Tennessee. So I moved here in 2003, okay? So right up to that point, I had this one neighbor, I won't mention his name, but he had Dodge Darts, okay? He wasn't a Mopar guy, but he had determined that the 6-cylinder Dodge Dart, the Slant 6 Dodge Dart, was the bulletproof car. And he maintained these, he had a small fleet of them. He had like 3 of these things, right? His wife hated them. His kids hated them. He was the laughing stock of the neighborhood because he was driving these cars. He had milk crates full of replacement parts for them. And he would just keep driving them and driving them and driving them, and they ran fine. And he would rack up, God only knows how many miles, because he was driving these cars like 30 years after they were built. Everybody knew that guy who kept those 60s and 70s cars alive way, way, way past everybody else, because he wasn't afraid to tinker. He knew that these things would keep running. So when the choke pull-off went bad, he changed the choke pull-off. When it needed an alternator, he put an alternator in it. It needed a radiator, he put a radiator in it. And it just keep it going and keep it going and keep it going. At the end of the day, monetarily, these guys won. They lost in terms of, like, the status wars, but monetarily, they really got their money out of those cars. And to bring that point even further, you have to remember, like I said, I always see this comment, those cars were completely used up by 80 or 100,000 miles. But nobody ever takes into account fleet use. Taxi cabs of the era of the 60s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, that were on the road 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 3 years at a clip, right? They'd shut them off to maintain them and then start them back up again and send them back on the road. So those cars would routinely see 500, 600, 700,000 miles. Nobody kept track. It didn't matter anymore. After the odometer rolls over a couple of times, it's like, who cares how many miles it has on it? But they would keep going and going and going. One of the keys to that was that they were never shut off. They never had to go through those cooling and heating cycles. And so parts that would normally go because of the normal heating and cooling that an engine goes through, they went through a fraction of the heating and cooling cycles of the average car. But they would run and run and run. Police cars were the same way. Police cars, they would keep their fleets for 2 or 3 years. And these things were on the road constantly. Patrol cars never got shut off. They're always just passed from shift to shift, and they're always out rolling around a neighborhood. And those cars would rack up 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 miles before they would trade it in. And they were usually sold off used car dealer lots. They like Blues Brothers, okay? They had a zillion miles on them already, but they'd end up in a poorer neighborhood, and people would just drive them until the transmission fell out on the ground. There was no limit to the mileage or even the abuse that those cars would take as long as they were maintained. But it was the styling and the idea of obsolescence, of not being able to keep up with the Joneses, that kept people, the average person, from performing the normal maintenance that would have kept those cars alive, like right up to today. And to this day, there are still irrigation pump engines and stuff that they use in mines, that these engines have been like working since like 1963. And they're still there and they're still running and they're still doing their thing. And people are like, oh no, those things only lasted 80,000 miles and they were junk. No, to this day, there are still 50, 60, 70-year-old engines out there in the world that are just humming along and doing their thing decade after decade after decade in the dark. And nobody told them they're obsolete. If you guys found this video interesting, I really glossed over a lot of stuff, like having to do with internal engine components and stuff like that, rings and different dynamics between the older engines and the newer engines that would kind of give that perception of not lasting as long. I could do more on this, or if not, we'll just leave it where it is. But yeah, myth busted. That is why people have, and this is the longest standing perception there is, this is why people have that perception that old cars didn't last more than 70, 80, 100,000 miles. And new cars will keep going and going and going because they're so much better. That's not the fact. See you tomorrow.